car dealership manager snubs Jim Carrey after mistaking him for a scammer customer. His reaction made the man quit his job. The gloomy Los Angeles afternoon cast long shadows across Wilshire Boulevard, the overcast sky mirroring the weight many carried in their hearts that day. Jim Carrey, the man whose infectious energy and larger-than-life expressions had brought laughter to millions, found himself in an unusually contemplative mood as he navigated his Tesla through the city's winding streets. Gone were the animated gestures and the rubber-faced expressions that had become his trademark. Instead, his features held a quiet thoughtfulness that few ever got to witness. Dressed down in a way that would have surprised his fans, a worn-out navy blue t-shirt that had seen better days and a pair of comfortable Levi's, Jim barely resembled the polished Hollywood star that regularly graced red carpets and magazine covers. His salt and pepper beard, slightly unkempt, added to the casual appearance that made him almost unrecognizable to the casual observer. The morning had started with an inexplicable urge, a gentle nudge from the universe that whispered of the possibility of making this seemingly ordinary Tuesday into something meaningful. Jim had learned over the years to trust these subtle promptings. They often led to the most authentic moments in his life, the kind that couldn't be scripted or planned. As he drove past the iconic Beverly Hills Hotel, his mind wandered to recent conversations with his daughter Jane about the nature of spontaneous kindness. "Sometimes," she had said over their last FaceTime call, "the best things we do are the ones we never planned." The wisdom in her words had stuck with him, echoing in his thoughts as he navigated through the familiar streets of his adopted home city. The traffic light turned red at the intersection of Rodeo Drive, and Jim's gaze drifted to the storefronts lining the prestigious street. Each window displayed carefully curated luxury items, but it was the gleaming cars at Harrison's Luxury Motors that caught his attention. The dealership stood proud among its high-end neighbors, its floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing a collection of vehicles that would make any car enthusiast's heart race. Something about the place called to him. Maybe it was the way the California sun, breaking through the clouds for just a moment, caught the metallic finish of a vintage Aston Martin in the showroom. Or perhaps it was the small group of people inside, their body language suggesting the kind of everyday drama that often led to unexpected opportunities for connection. Jim pulled his car into an empty parking spot across the street, his mind already spinning with possibilities. Throughout his career, he had learned that sometimes the best way to lift your own spirits was to find ways to lift others. His characters, from the manic energy of Ace Ventura to the heartwarming sincerity of Truman Burbank, had taught him that laughter and kindness were universal languages that could bridge any gap. As he stepped out of his car, a cool breeze ruffled his hair, carrying with it the distinct scent of rain, unusual for Los Angeles this time of year. The sound of his boots on the pavement seemed to echo his heartbeat, steady and purposeful. Each step toward the dealership felt like moving closer to something significant, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what that might be. The exterior of Harrison's Luxury Motors was imposing in its elegance, all chrome, glass, and modern architectural lines. The cars displayed in the window weren't just vehicles. They were works of art, each one representing someone's dream of freedom, success, or adventure. Jim smiled to himself, remembering his first car, a beat-up Volkswagen Beetle that had been more rust than paint. How far he'd come from those early days in Toronto, when the idea of walking into a place like this would have seemed as fantastical as his wildest comedy routines. Just before reaching the entrance, Jim caught his reflection in the spotless glass. The man looking back at him wasn't the comedic genius that audiences knew, nor was he the philosophical artist whose paintings expressed deep emotional truths. This was just Jim, a human being following an instinct, hoping to make a difference in someone's day, even if he wasn't quite sure how yet. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the heavy glass door, stepping into the climate-controlled showroom. The smell of leather and new cars filled his nostrils, mixing with the subtle hint of expensive cologne and coffee from the customer lounge. The pristine floors reflected the overhead lighting like mirrors, and the gentle hum of conversations and distant phones ringing created a symphony of luxury retail atmosphere. As he moved further into the showroom, Jim felt, rather than saw, the shift in attention. A few heads turned, eyes widened in recognition, then quickly looked away in that particularly LA way of pretending not to notice celebrities. But there was something else in the air, a tension, an energy that suggested he had walked into more than just a high-end car dealership. He had walked into a moment, one of those cosmic intersections where ordinary days transform into extraordinary memories. Running his hand along the smooth finish of a nearby Ferrari, Jim smiled that subtle, knowing smile that had become more common in his later years. Whatever was about to unfold in this temple of automotive luxury, he was ready for it. After all, life, as he had learned through both triumph and tragedy, was nothing if not a series of unexpected encounters, each one carrying the potential for magic. The soft whir of the climate control system and the muted conversations across the showroom floor seemed to fade into silence as Michael Thompson's footsteps echoed against the polished marble. The dealership manager, a man whose once pristine Brooks Brothers suit now hung slightly loose on his frame, approached Jim with the kind of calculated disdain usually reserved for unwanted solicitors. Standing at 6 feet tall with graying temples and deep-set eyes that hadn't seen a proper rest in weeks, Michael cut an imposing figure despite his obvious exhaustion. His appearance, normally meticulously maintained as befitting the manager of one of Beverly Hills's most prestigious dealerships, showed subtle signs of neglect, a slightly crooked tie, the shadow of a day-old stubble, and dark circles under his eyes that even his expensive concealer couldn't quite hide. "Can I help you?" The words sliced through the air, each syllable dripping with barely concealed contempt. Michael's gaze swept over Jim's casual attire, the kind of dressed-down look that actual wealthy clients of Harrison's luxury motors would never dare to wear when shopping for six-figure vehicles. Jim, who had spent decades using humor to diffuse tense situations both on and off screen, instinctively fell back on his trademark expressions. His eyebrows danced upward in that iconic way that had made millions laugh in Ace Ventura, followed by the elastic grin that had become his calling card. Well, unless these cars drive themselves, which, hey, maybe they do these days, I might need a little help taking one for a spin. The attempt at levity fell flat against Michael's stone-cold demeanor. If anything, the manager's expression hardened further, his jaw clenching visibly. A young sales associate named Brandon, who had been arranging brochures nearby, winced at the growing tension. He recognized Jim immediately, but remained frozen in place, caught between professional protocol and the surreal scene unfolding before him. "Sir," Michael's voice took on an edge sharp enough to cut glass, "we deal with a very specific clientele here at Harrison's. I'm sure you can understand that we need to be selective about who we allow to test drive our vehicles." His eyes narrowed, focusing on a small coffee stain on Jim's t-shirt. "Perhaps there's another dealership that might be more suitable for your situation." The showroom had grown eerily quiet. A couple who had been examining a Bentley Continental GT slowly backed away from the scene, their designer shoes clicking softly against the floor. At the reception desk, Amanda Chen, the dealership's veteran receptionist of 15 years, watched with growing dismay as her usually professional boss became increasingly confrontational. Jim's smile didn't waver, though it shifted from playful to gentle. "You know, I once played a character who judged everything by its cover. Turned out he was missing all the best stories." He gestured toward a pristine Aston Martin DB11. "That's a beautiful machine. Reminds me of the one I drove in." "Well, never mind that." Michael's face flushed red, his patience visibly evaporating. "Listen here." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that somehow seemed louder than a shout. "I've dealt with enough scammers this month trying to joyride in cars they couldn't afford in their wildest dreams. You walk in here looking like you just rolled out of bed, probably thinking you're clever with your Jim Carrey impression. But I've seen your type before." Several employees exchanged uncomfortable glances. Sarah Martinez, a senior sales associate who had been with the dealership for over a decade, took a half step forward before stopping herself. She knew Jim was the real deal. She'd just watched Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind for the third time last weekend. But something in her boss's demeanor made her hesitate to intervene. "In fact," Michael continued, his voice rising slightly, his right hand unconsciously adjusting his wedding ring, a nervous habit that had become more pronounced in recent weeks, "you look exactly like that con artist who tried to walk away with a Ferrari last Tuesday. Same shabby clothes, same cocky attitude, same stupid grin." The air in the showroom grew thick with tension. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, The Los Angeles sky had darkened further, and the first drops of rain began to paint dark spots on the glass. The soft lighting reflecting off the luxury vehicles cast strange shadows across Michael's face, emphasizing the deep lines of stress and something else, something that looked remarkably like pain. Jim's expression softened further, the comedian's mask falling away completely. In its place was the look of a man who had known his own share of darkness, who recognized the signs of a soul in turmoil. He'd seen that same haunted look in his own mirror during some of his hardest years, when depression had threatened to overwhelm him. "You know," Jim said quietly, his voice carrying none of his famous character's inflections, "sometimes the hardest people to deal with are the ones fighting battles we know nothing about." He paused, studying Michael's face with genuine concern. "And sometimes the people who push others away the hardest are the ones who need connection the most." Michael's face contorted with a complex mix of emotions, anger still prominent, but now tinged with confusion, and something that looked almost like recognition. The rain outside had picked up, creating a soft drumming against the windows that seemed to underscore the tense tableau. Around them, the showroom had become a theater of frozen figures. Every employee, every customer stood still, watching this unexpected drama play out against a backdrop of million-dollar automobiles and premium leather upholstery. The scene was surreal, a Hollywood star in casual clothes facing off against a grieving manager who didn't even realize who he was confronting, all while the California rain painted tears down the windows of one of Beverly Hills' most exclusive car dealerships. The tension in Harrison's luxury motors hung thick in the air like the heavy clouds outside. But something in Jim's last words had caused a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The actor, known for his larger-than-life performances, stood quietly now, his eyes fixed on Michael Thompson, with the kind of understanding that comes only from having walked through similar valleys of darkness. It was during this momentary stillness that Sandra Wilson, the dealership's finance manager of 15 years, made her way across the showroom floor. Her sensible heels barely made a sound on the polished marble as she approached Jim, her experienced eyes taking in the situation with the wisdom of someone who had watched the dealership's dynamics change dramatically over the past month. Keeping her voice low enough that only Jim could hear, Sandra leaned in close. The faint scent of her signature Chanel perfume mingled with the new car smell as she whispered, "He lost his wife, Caroline, and their newborn daughter, Emma, 3 weeks ago. There were complications during childbirth. Neither of them made it." Her voice caught slightly on the last words. "He hasn't been the same since then." The information hit Jim like a physical force, causing him to take a small step back. His mind immediately flashed to his own experiences with loss, the devastating death of his former girlfriend, Catriona White, the painful battles with depression that had shaped his life and art. In an instant, Michael's hostile behavior transformed from simple rudeness into something far more profound, the raw, unprocessed grief of a man whose entire world had collapsed in a single day. The rain outside had intensified, its rhythmic pounding against the windows providing a somber soundtrack to the scene. Through the streams of water on the glass, the Los Angeles afternoon had turned as dark as twilight, matching the heaviness of the revelation that had just been shared. Jim's gaze returned to Michael, but now he saw everything differently. The slightly rumpled suit wasn't just negligence. It was likely Caroline's doing before, keeping her husband's wardrobe impeccable. The wedding ring that Michael kept fidgeting with probably felt like it was burning his skin. The bags under his eyes weren't just from working too hard. They were the marks of sleepless nights spent staring at an empty nursery that would never welcome its intended occupant. Sandra stepped back, merging with the small crowd of employees who had gathered at a respectful distance. Among them was Tony Martinez, the veteran mechanic who had worked on the Thompson family's cars for years. He remembered how excited Michael had been just a month ago, showing everyone the ultrasound pictures, talking about the pink paint he and Caroline had chosen for the nursery. The showroom's soft lighting caught the moisture in Michael's eyes, tears he was fighting desperately to hold back, probably the same way he had been fighting them since that tragic day at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. His aggressive stance had softened slightly, replaced by the barely concealed exhaustion of someone carrying an unbearable weight. Jim thought about his own journey through grief and depression, the times when he had painted massive canvases filled with color and pain, trying to express what words couldn't capture. He thought about the moments when his famous smile had been nothing but a mask, hiding the storms that raged beneath. In Michael, he recognized that same desperate attempt to maintain control when everything else had spiraled into chaos. Through the showroom speakers, the soft jazz music that typically provided pleasant background ambiance seemed jarringly inappropriate now. Each cheerful note felt like a mockery of the pain that hung in the air between these two men. One a celebrated actor who had made millions laugh while fighting his own battles with depression. The other a grieving husband and father whose entire future had been rewritten in a single tragic moment. Outside, a crack of thunder rolled across the Los Angeles sky, making several people jump. The sound seemed to break something in Michael's carefully maintained facade. His shoulders slumped slightly, and for just a moment, the mask of anger slipped, revealing the devastating grief beneath. Jim took a careful step forward, his movements gentle as if approaching a wounded animal. He understood now that this wasn't about cars or appearances or even proper business protocol. This was about a man standing at the edge of an abyss, using anger as a lifeline because everything else had been torn away. The collection of luxury vehicles surrounding them, the Ferraris, Bentleys, and Aston Martins that typically represented success and achievement, now seemed to Jim like nothing more than elaborate props in a scene about something far more fundamental: human suffering and the possibility of connection in the midst of profound loss. Sandy Harrison, the dealership's owner, watched the scene unfold from her office upstairs. Through the glass walls, she could see the shift in dynamics, the way Jim Carrey, someone who could have reacted with celebrity indignation to being treated so poorly, instead stood with the kind of patience that spoke of deep, personal understanding. The rain continued its relentless drumming against the windows, creating a cocoon of sound around the showroom. In this moment of revelation, time seemed to stand still, the usual bustle of the prestigious Beverly Hills dealership fading into the background. Here were two men, standing amid millions of dollars worth of luxury vehicles, connected not by their social status or their positions, but by their understanding of life's most profound sorrows. Jim's expression, which had moments ago been an attempt at humorous connection, now held nothing but compassionate recognition. In his years of bringing laughter to millions, he had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can offer another person is the simple acknowledgement of their pain. As he stood there, watching Michael Thompson struggle with his grief in the middle of his pristine showroom, Jim made a decision that would transform this chance encounter into something neither man would ever forget. Sometimes pain makes us build walls so high that we forget what the sun looks like, Jim said softly, his words cutting through the ambient sound of rain against the showroom windows. The statement hit Michael with unexpected force, making him physically step back as if struck. The carefully constructed facade of anger and irritation that had been his shield for the past 3 weeks began to crack. The luxurious showroom of Harrison's Luxury Motors, with its perfect lighting and gleaming vehicles, seemed to hold its breath. The assembled staff, who had been watching the confrontation unfold, noticed the shift in their manager's demeanor immediately. It was as if someone had deflated a balloon, the tension in Michael's shoulders visibly released, though the pain in his eyes remained. "I've been in dark places too, Michael," Jim continued, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience. Places where tomorrow seemed impossible, where every sunrise felt like an insult. He moved closer, but not threateningly, rather with the careful consideration of someone who understood the fragility of the moment. Places where the world keeps spinning, even though your personal universe has completely stopped. Michael's hands, which had been clenched at his sides, slowly relaxed. The wedding ring on his left hand caught the light, and his right hand instinctively moved to touch it, a gesture Jim didn't miss. The actor recognized it as the same unconscious movement he'd made countless times after losing Catriona, touching memories that could no longer touch back. Thunder rolled outside again, but this time it seemed less intrusive, more like a distant accompaniment to the scene unfolding within. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm, creating a protective curtain of sound around the showroom, as if nature itself was providing privacy for this unexpected moment of connection. Then, in a move that sent a ripple of surprise through the watching staff, Jim began to walk purposefully through the showroom. His casual demeanor shifted to something more decisive, though the compassion in his eyes remained. He stopped first at a midnight blue Aston Martin DB11, running his hand along its sleek surface. "This one," he said firmly, then moved to a Ferrari F8 Tributo in classic Rosso Corsa red. "This one too." His steps took him to a Bentley Continental GT in British racing green. "Definitely this one." Michael watched in growing confusion as Jim continued his tour of the showroom's most expensive vehicles. The actor's movements were deliberate, each selection made with the same care one might use in choosing flowers for a memorial. Thoughtful, purposeful, meaningful. In fact, Jim turned to face Michael, his expression both serious and gentle. "I'll take every top-end car you have in stock." He gestured expansively at the collection of luxury vehicles around them. Every single one of them. The showroom erupted in hushed whispers. Sandra Wilson, who had revealed Michael's tragedy to Jim, pressed a hand to her mouth in surprise. Brandon, the young sales associate, nearly dropped the tablet he was holding. Even Sandy Harrison, watching from her office above, stood up from her desk in astonishment. But it wasn't the astronomical amount of money involved that held everyone's attention. It was the way Jim was handling the situation. There was no triumphant gloating, no celebrity power play. Instead, each indication of a vehicle was accompanied by a story, a small personal connection that transformed the transaction from a simple purchase into something more meaningful. "This Porsche 911, Jim said, stopping beside a slate gray sports car. "Reminds me of a time when I thought I'd never laugh again. But you know what? The sun has this funny way of rising, even on the days we wish it wouldn't." His words were clearly meant for Michael, who had unconsciously moved closer to listen. As Jim continued his selections, the other employees began to notice something remarkable happening to their manager. The harsh lines of anger that had marked Michael's face for weeks began to soften. The defensive posture he'd maintained since losing Caroline and Emma gradually relaxed. It wasn't just the prospect of the largest commission in the dealership's history. It was the recognition of shared pain, the understanding that someone else had walked through similar darkness and emerged on the other side. "Life has this way," Jim continued, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed showroom, "of offering us unexpected lifelines when we're drowning. Sometimes they come in the form of a friend, sometimes a stranger, and sometimes—" He paused, gesturing at the gathered luxury vehicles. "Sometimes they come in the form of something completely unexpected." The rain outside had begun to ease, and through the windows, the first hints of late afternoon sunlight were breaking through the clouds. The timing seemed almost choreographed, as if the weather itself was underlining Jim's words about hope and possibility. Michael, who hadn't shed a tear since the funeral, felt moisture gathering in his eyes. The wall of anger he'd built around his grief began to crumble, not in a devastating collapse, but in a gentle dissolution that felt more like release than defeat. For the first time since losing his family, he allowed himself to be seen not as the stern manager of Harrison's luxury motors, but as a man dealing with unimaginable loss. The transformation wasn't just in Michael. The entire atmosphere of the showroom had shifted. What had begun as a confrontation had evolved into something profound, a reminder that beneath the trappings of luxury cars and business transactions, there existed a deeper current of human connection and understanding. After the paperwork was completed and the showroom had cleared of its usual crowd, Jim and Michael found themselves in the manager's office, a space that still held traces of a happier life. A framed ultrasound photo sat face down on the desk, and a half-empty cup of coffee had long since gone cold. Through the office windows, the late afternoon sun had finally broken through the clouds, casting long shadows across the room. "Sometimes we need a push from fate to take our first steps in a new direction," Jim said, settling into one of the leather chairs across from Michael's desk. The actor's casual attire seemed less out of place now, as if the earlier events had transformed the very atmosphere of the prestigious dealership. "The commission from this sale, use it not just for travel, but to find yourself again." Michael's hands trembled slightly as he reached for a tissue from the box his wife had chosen for his office. A small detail that suddenly felt enormously significant. "I don't even know where to begin," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "Every morning I put on this suit like armor, come to this office, and pretend I'm still the same person I was before." He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The silence that followed was comfortable, understanding. Outside the office, The usual sounds of the dealership continued. Phones ringing, distant conversations, the soft hum of luxury car engines being moved around the lot. But within these walls, time seemed to move differently. "You know," Michael continued, years of pent-up frustration suddenly finding their voice. "This place, it's become toxic for me. Every sale reminds me of the future I was saving for. The college fund for Emma, the vacation home Caroline and I planned to buy." He gestured at the window overlooking the showroom floor. "But I felt trapped. The money, the stability. I couldn't walk away." Jim leaned forward, his expression serious but gentle. "The universe has a way of opening doors when we least expect it. Sometimes those doors look like coincidences, sometimes like accidents, and sometimes," he smiled slightly, "they look like a scruffy guy in a faded t-shirt walking into a luxury car dealership." Michael laughed for the first time in weeks. A small, broken sound, but genuine. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out an envelope he'd prepared months ago, but never had the courage to submit. His resignation letter. The paper felt lighter now, less like a surrender and more like a beginning. "I think it's time," he said, more to himself than to Jim. With steady hands, he signed and dated the letter. The scratch of his pen on paper seemed to echo in the quiet office, marking the moment when one chapter of his life ended and another began. As the sun continued its descent over Los Angeles, casting the city in shades of gold and purple, Jim watched Michael pack up his personal items, the few things that really mattered. The ultrasound photo was carefully wrapped in tissue paper, Caroline's favorite picture of them together, gently placed in a box alongside it. "The hardest part about grief," Jim shared, helping Michael take down a framed dealership award, "isn't the big moments. It's the small ones, when you see something beautiful and turn to share it with someone who isn't there anymore. But eventually, those moments become less like stabs to the heart and more like gentle reminders of love." The story of that day never made it to the headlines or social media. Jim made sure of that, understanding that some of life's most profound transformations happen best away from the spotlight. The paperwork for the multiple luxury car purchases was processed quietly, with provisions made for various charities to benefit from the vehicles. Months passed, and life at Harrison's Luxury Motors continued. New salespeople were hired, new records were set, new stories were created. But something had changed in the atmosphere of the place, a gentle reminder that behind every transaction, there was a human story waiting to be understood. Then one day, a postcard arrived at the dealership. It showed a sunset over the Santorini coastline, the white buildings glowing gold in the fading light. On the back, in Michael's neat handwriting, was a simple message. "Thank you for showing me that even in the darkest days, there's still room for light." The postcard was passed around among the staff, each person touching it like a talisman, remembering the day when everything changed. The story became a quiet legend among the employees, shared in break rooms and during quiet moments between sales. It wasn't just about the day Jim Carrey bought out half their inventory. It was about the transformation of a moment of hostility into a lesson about compassion, understanding, and the importance of looking beyond appearances. Sandra Wilson had the postcard framed and hung it in the employee lounge, a reminder that sometimes the greatest acts of kindness come wrapped in unexpected packages. And occasionally, when a particularly difficult customer would come in, someone would glance at that postcard and remember to look deeper, to see beyond the surface to the human story beneath. Jim Carrey, the man who had made millions laugh, had demonstrated that sometimes the most significant gestures are those made in silence, driven by pure empathy. His fame hadn't come from his ability to make that sale, or even from his generous spirit. It had come from his understanding that every human being, no matter how guarded or hostile, carries a story worth hearing. The legend of that rainy Los Angeles afternoon lives on, a quiet reminder that in a world of luxury cars and high-stakes sales, the most valuable currency is still human connection, and the greatest transformations often begin with a simple act of understanding.